Today on AmyQuilts.com, I'm going to show you a variety of feather techniques, beginning with the basic shape of a teardrop, the half heart, and then the more traditional elongated combination of the teardrop and half heart. Then we'll make a spine and start on our feather plumes in a variety of methods. Let's get to it. When it comes to doing feathers, there's all kinds of sizes and shapes you can do, but the key elements are the spine and the plume. So we're going to start off with the plume. And the plume essentially is a teardrop, just a little teardrop. But some people also refer to it as a half heart shape. So think of doodling in school when you were a kid. I'm going to go ahead and just cut that so you can see that by itself. This piece right here is half of a heart. It makes a good little start to a feather, though it's a little short for most feathers. Let's get those threads up and out of the way. So what you want to think about is elongating that plume and bringing it in. So it's kind of a combination between a teardrop and a half heart. But without the spine, we're kind of traveling blind. So what we really need is a spine. So I'm just going to kind of come over here. The spine is just basically the midrib of our feather. And I'm going to do a nice long one. Speed up my machine so that we get some nice stitch length as I make this long line. Just doing a nice gradual curve. Nothing too tricky at first. And then I'm putting a teardrop at the end. That teardrop acts as the end of our plume, just a nice little tip. And then I'm going to come back down along here, and I can travel right along that spine, so it's one continuous line, or I can bring it out and make that spine a wider element of my design. You can even make it extra wide and put designs inside the spine, like pebbles or little tiny designs that fit down in there. So we're going to start off on this side. And I always work all my feathers from the bottom to the top. If you're really, really talented, you can work in any direction on your feathers, working from the top down. I always work from my bottom up my spine so far. I've tried it the other way a couple of times, and I just don't get the results I want. So I'm going to start with my first plume, and I'm working from the bottom and around. So I've got that teardrop shape, that half heart. As I come into that spine, I want to taper it gently into the spine. We don't want to make any blunt feather plumes. So these are just kind of your basic plumes tapering into that spine. They can touch the spine, they can stick out a little bit. You can make them so you're backtracking in between each feather plume. But you really want to bring them in to that spine at a nice angle. You don't want to do something like this. I've got my half heart shape and I bring it into my plume like that. It's just really wide and blunt, and it's just not graceful like we think about with a feather. Is it passable? It can be, depending on the style of your quilt, but it's just not really the look we want to go for. So let's get that better to a nice, elongated, curving plume. We don't want to make it where you're traveling all the way back to your starting position, because it's going to build up a lot of thread along your spine. And it's also going to make it harder to travel down the spine. So So far, I've mostly been leaving a little space between the plumes. So now I'm going to do it where I'm backtracking in between each plume. I have to go a little bit slower. Bring that line in nice and graceful. You can make it longer and thinner. If you like the style of feather where they're all touching each other, you may prefer to do what's called a bump back feather. And that's how a lot of long armors make their feathers. And so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. Instead of starting at the bottom of the plume, this next one is going to start out farther. We're going to come out here. We're going to make our plume. You see that difference? It really hooks into the previous feather, into the previous plume. And then we're backtracking along the tip and then coming back around and in. So you're alternating kind of that shape. You can bring these out a bunch and make them curvy. You can reduce your backtracking by just doing a little bit here and making them nestle around each other. You can make them really long and fancy, kind of like those ostrich fans that a showgirl might use in Vegas. You can alternate the length where you have a short one followed by a longer curvy one. And these are the bump back feathers. This reduces the amount of traveling that you're doing and puts those double stitches, the backtracking, at the tips versus in between the plumes. Let's finish those out. When you get to the tips of your feather, typically you're going to make your plumes smaller. Might even throw a little tiny one right there at the tip. And now I want to start back at the beginning of my feathered spine, and I can do that either by backtracking along the spine, or I can do it by going around the outside. So for this one, I'm going to go ahead and do it around the outside, just to do something a little different. And I'm just echoing around. Entirely up to you how deep that echo is. Whether it's narrow, whether it's larger. But typically you're not going into the feather in between the plumes. You're just echoing. This can really help to set your feather apart from any dense background fills. Whereas bringing the fills right into the feather plume can really make the feather plume pop. Going around those blunt ones right there. One thing you want to make sure you do with feather plumes is you don't want to whip them out in the curves too much, because that can really cause eyelashes, and we don't want eyelashes. So now we're back at the beginning. And because this is just a sample, I'm just going to stitch across the end. And let's see, we've got some other types of feathers that we can do besides the bump back feathers. There are hooked feathers. And hooked feathers start off with a normal plume. I'm going to keep these plumes small because we're in this curve here of this spine. I'm going to come up the spine just like a bump back feather, and you're going to kiss or just bump that previous plume, and you're going to come back around, and it basically makes a hook. So this is really the space between two feathers, but it looks like three. So let's bring that back around and do it again. So I'm making a hooked shape. I'm bumping into my previous feather plume and coming back up. It's really just quilting a hook. And this can be a rather simple way of doing feather plumes as well. One thing you want to watch out for is making them too short and blunt, and this is any style of feather, because you can end up making them look a little bit like the large intestine. If you remember some of your anatomy photos, if they're very even and short and blunt, they can kind of end up looking like an intestine. And that's really not what we want to make on our quilts. So those are our hooked feathers. Let's do one more. Just bringing it in nice and gracefully into that spine. And then another one that I like to teach my beginning free motion quilters is called the fern feather. And that's very different from these feathers. They're not curved at the tips, they're much more pointy. But sometimes when you're learning to do free motion, having a point to stop at can be a little bit easier than keeping all these nice curves. So it is very reminiscent of a fern leaf versus a feather, and it's an open S shape. It's a little double curve, curving to the left and then curving to the right and back in. If you are a person who likes to make more pointy and geometric designs, this may be the feather for you. I find people kind of have a tendency towards curvy or pointy, and so this is a pointy variety. And you just keep going, just like you were making another feather. Next, I want to show you a design that's called a molar feather. And we'll fit in a few in here. We may try to do another one. Molar feather looks like a molar tooth. It's a lot more graceful than a molar, but it comes out and it has a double curve at the end. And comes in. They're typically not as long and narrow as your average feather. They can be very good at fitting a feather into a straighter area. You know, these they're varying heights, but if you created them all along an edge, they fill in that edge a lot smoother than the curved tips. So we have filled in this whole entire feather so far, and one of the fun things about doing feathers is that you can then embellish them. So as I come down my feather, I'm going to embellish these things. So I'm going to do just a curved echo at the tip here. You can embellish by just echoing what you've already done in your feather, in your plumes. You can do little spines up the middle. You can do double embellishments. So here's that little spine. Now we're going to do a little loop for these little ferny feathers. I think just a simple vein is appropriate. I have done these ferny feathers on quilts with a lot of batiks, and those have looked fabulous. So I'm just going to leave those empty. And here we've got the hooked feathers. You can embellish those as well. I like to come in here on the inside part of those hooks and do a little double thing. They're a little bit easier to embellish than the actual hooked shapes. And of course, you can give it a double echo. This is very helpful if you've made rather large feather plumes and they're kind of open and plain in the centers. You can go back in and spruce them up with a little detail stitching. So I'm going to come back in down here. We're going to come up over here on this basic side. This is where we started off. You can come in and you can do little curls. I typically don't add anything to my feather plumes unless they are rather large. And since I am a quilt pusher instead of a long arm machine mover, I am controlled in the size of my feather plumes by what I can fit between my hands here. So next is how you can do a feather fill. And I'm going to sneak up in between here. It means I'm going to cut through this little echo shape, but this is just a learning sample. No big deal. And show you how I do a feather echo. Not a feather echo, a feather fill. So I start off with a long, rather narrow plume. And I use that actual plume to feather off of. I like to get it so that they're not backtracking. It makes it faster. And I can go ahead and feather all the way around the top if I want. And then when I'm done, I can create another large plume and feather off of it. If I want to change my direction like I have here because I'm at the end of my quilt area, I can just kind of come down in here and put in another feather plume. And you can make these as big as you want or as small as you want. And fill in an area with them. Definitely want to vary the size of your stitches. The smaller you go, the smaller your stitches need to be. And that is a good overview of the different types of feathers that you can do. So I hope you found that interesting and helpful. Thanks for watching. Again, this is Amy from AmyQuilts.com. Bye-bye.